and nuclear disarmament working groups, I want to welcome you to today's very important discussion on Zaporizhzhia, facing the dangers of nuclear power plants in war and peace. Zaporizhzhia is a prime example of the dangers of nuclear power plants, especially in areas of conflict. We seek to understand what is happening, what may happen, and what can possibly be done to reduce the risk as soon as possible. Just a few program thoughts. Please make sure you are muted. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and please put them into chat or in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do the best we can to get them answered. We'll start first with presentations from Oleg Bodrov and Linda Pence-Gunter, followed by questions for both of our presenters, and then lots of time for questions from you, our participants. The program is slated for an hour. However, if there's still significant interest, we can go a little bit beyond. Please feel free to put your name in chat, and please let us know where you're from. Just a few announcements. Wednesday, December 14th, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, a webinar, Russia and Europe, the Ukraine War and Possibilities for Euro-Atlantic Peace, with Werner Braun, who served as Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau, sponsored by the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and co-sponsored by Mass Peace Action. Please see the chat or go to the Mass Peace Action website and calendar. I also want to alert you to an action. Mass Peace Action has joined the international call to faith leaders for a Christmas truce from December 25th to January 7th. See the information in chat. Thanks, Cole. This from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Quote, as people of faith and conscience, believing in the sanctity of all life on this planet, we call for a Christmas truce in Ukraine. In the spirit of the truce that occurred in 1914 during the First World War, we urge our government to take a leadership role in bringing the war in Ukraine to an end through supporting calls for a ceasefire and negotiated settlement before the conflict results in a nuclear war that could devastate the world's ecosystems and annihilate all of God's creation, unquote. So please sign on as individuals, and if you're part of a community of faith, please encourage others to join in this effort. In Massachusetts, there'll be an event in Amherst on December 17th. We're hoping to have an event in Boston or Cambridge sometime between December 19th and the 23rd. Keep a lookout for announcements. Now, to get us started, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Joseph Gerson, a longtime prolific peace advocate. He is the co-convener of the Peace and Planet Network and the president of CPDCS, otherwise known as the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. Joseph.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for really putting this webinar together. It is both a pleasure and actually an honor to be introducing my friend Oleg Bodrov, who is a quietly courageous and deeply committed scientist and advocate for nuclear disarmament and nuclear safety. He is an engineer, physicist, environmentalist, and chairman of the Public Council of the South Coast of the Gulf of Finland. He's in St. Petersburg. For a number of you, you may want to take out your map and see where the Gulf of Finland is. He was elected to be a member of the board of directors of the International Peace Bureau this past October. Oleg is one of the leaders of the Russian peace, environmental protection, and nuclear safety movements. In coalition with partners from the Baltic Sea countries, he works to reduce the level of confrontation between NATO and Russia in the Baltic. He has also been warning about the vulnerabilities and dangers of nuclear power plants in war zones and potential war zones since before Russia's misnamed special military operation, which has precipitated the crisis at Zaporizhzhia. Oleg is an author of numerous reports at international anti-war conferences in Helsinki, Paris, New York, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, producer of documentaries on the consequences of nuclear weapons production and peaceful nuclear energy. Maybe the last thing to say, I met Oleg quite some years ago in Hiroshima. And it was then that I learned that after the Chernobyl meltdown, he had doubts about the accuracy of the initial reports. He went to Chernobyl, took his own measurements, then came back to St. Petersburg and published them, at which point it became necessary for him to change his career. And that kind of courage has marked Oleg's life. And I just have the greatest respect for my dear friend. So Oleg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, for wonderful presentation. And I'd like to say good afternoon, Massachusetts. Good evening, Europe. Dear organizers and participants of the webinar, thank you for the invitation to discuss the safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I am speaking to you from the Russian coast of the Baltic Sea. It's over 4,000 miles from Boston and 1,000 miles from Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The topic of our discussion is relevant not only for the Ukraine, Russia, but also for our planet. I formulated this topic as follows: nuclear power plants as a new type of the weapons of mass destruction. This may seem like an exaggeration, but what is happened with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is not only a risk for the radioactive contamination of Europe. This is destruction of the institutional mechanism of global security. I will try to justify this position. To start a little history. The first nuclear explosion took place on July 16, 1945 in New Mexico. But we can talk about nuclear weapons only after the explosion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945. The number of victims of this explosion in Japan after 70 years reached 450,000 people. The desire to possess nuclear weapons has become a goal for politicians in many countries. The threat of blackmail of its use has become an instrument of international politics. Nuclear power plants began to build as a demonstration of the possibility of the peaceful use of nuclear energy. But on April 26, 1986, Chernobyl happened. This completely destroyed the peaceful image of nuclear energy. In the 20 years after Chernobyl, additional deaths in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus increased by about 237,000. In Europe by 400,000. In Asia, Africa, and North America by 330,000. The total number of victims of Chernobyl in the world can reach 1 million people, and this number will continue to grow for a generation to come. Moreover, if Hiroshima and Nagasaki were returned to the former place, it would be impossible to live near Chernobyl nuclear power plant for hundreds and maybe thousands of years. That is, the destruction of Chernobyl nuclear power plant has a more serious and long-lasting impact than the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On February 25 and 28, 2022, Russian troops using heavy military equipment took control of the Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants. The fighting in the area of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant can lead consequences exceeding the Chernobyl tragedy. That is, the peaceful atom has actually turned into potential dirty bombs. February 2022 can be considered the birthday of new type of the weapons of mass destruction. These weapons could contaminate the northern hemisphere with long-lived radionuclides, cause multi-million casualties. An important detail, even technologically backward countries that do not have nuclear weapons can use these weapons. It is enough to capture of nuclear power plant on enemy territory, and you can dictate terms not only to this country but to the world war. After February, we can assume that Europe, including Russia and America, is mined by nuclear power plants. There is a time bombs and can be destroyed in any time. Let's to compare the explosion of the little boy plutonium bomb in Nagasaki and hypothetical destruction of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants with its storage of spent nuclear fuel. The mass of plutonium in the Nagasaki bomb was 6.4 kilograms. During a nuclear explosion, approximately 85% of mass of plutonium was transformed into shockwave, thermal, X-ray radiation. There are instant destructive factors. Only 15% or less 1 kilogram became radioactive contamination, a factor of long-term damaging effects. Approximately 50 tons of plutonium have been accumulated at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and in the storage of spent nuclear fuel. This is 50,000 times more than the mass of radioactive contamination after the explosion in Nagasaki. Plutonium is known to have a half-life of 24,000 years. This means that in the event of the destruction of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, gigantic territories of the northern hemisphere may be polluted. And this pollution will persist for the thousands of years, and the area is several times larger than after Chernobyl disaster. What legal mechanism protected peaceful nuclear installation and facilities? Nuclear installations have been destroyed by military before. Israel destroyed nuclear research facilities in Iraq, in Syria. The risk of destruction of nuclear power plants and nuclear research facilities were also in Slovenia, Armenia, and other countries. Therefore, the International Atomic Energy Agency adopted a number of resolutions. They prohibit any armed attack on peaceful nuclear facilities. If it's happened, it's considered a violation principles of the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and the Charter of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant have been captured by neither the International Atomic Energy Agency nor the United Nations have been able to stop the dangerous scenario at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We are in the systemic crisis. Installations mechanism to ensure the safe operation of the nuclear power plants do not work. Other nuclear power plants in the world could also be captured and became blackmail mechanism and weapons of mass destruction. We need new stakeholders, new models of interaction for the construction of new security mechanism. Thank you.
Oleg, thank you very much. Your comparison of what would happen at Zaporizhzhia to the Nagasaki A-bomb is chilling to say the least. I appreciate you helping us to understand the danger in that way. Let me now turn the chairing over to Rosalie Andrews of Mass Peace Action, who will do our next introduction.
Great, thank you. I'm Rosalie Andrews, part of the Peace and Climate Working Group of Mass Peace Action. And we're very, very glad to have Linda Pence-Gunter with us as well. Linda founded Beyond Nuclear in 2007 and serves as its international specialist as well as its media and development director. She also writes for and curates Beyond Nuclear International. She has focused a great deal on fostering collaboration within the international anti-nuclear movement and on calling attention to the links between nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Before working in anti-nuclear advocacy, she was a journalist for 20 years in print and broadcast, working for USA Network, Reuters, The Times of London, and other US and international media. So welcome and thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Rosalie, and thanks to Susan for inviting me in the first place, and to Joe, and of course to my dear colleague and friend Alec Bodrov, who I've seen here and there in interesting parts of the globe, and I wish you all safety and security where you are now, Alec. I'm really glad to be speaking to a peace and disarmament group about nuclear power. That's a very welcome invitation to me, because we should always be talking about both. They are absolutely inextricably linked, and not just because we're seeing this played out so clearly in Ukraine. They're really linked every day, and it shouldn't take a war, I think, to bring into the headlines the true dangers of nuclear power, which, as Alec described perfectly, are essentially pre-deployed radiological weapons of mass destruction. And yet somehow, especially in the context of nuclear weapons disarmament, nuclear power has always been downplayed somewhat. It's like it's sort of the benign stepchild of the wicked, evil nuclear weapons stepmother. And that, I think, has to change. And we are some of the individuals and organizations who can change that. I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, I just want to put aside the issue of who is shelling who. There's been a lot of propaganda, news, fog of war about which side might actually be attacking one of these nuclear power plants. It doesn't obviously make sense for either side to do it, as it's clearly a suicide mission. But I think for us, that's not really the point. The point of this is that what it brings home most clearly is the true danger of nuclear power as a weapon of war. But it's not just a weapon in a war zone. It's dangerous and harmful every day. That nuclear power is inherently dangerous. And one of the things that struck me when we've been talking about the International Atomic Energy Agency and its head, Rafael Grossi, he made a comment that, well, it's not the nuclear reactors in Ukraine that are a problem, it's the war that's the problem, which sort of reminds me of the gun lobby saying, well, it's not guns that kill people, it's bad guys that kill people. But a bad guy without a gun can't shoot anybody. And if Ukraine, instead of having nuclear power plants, had solar arrays and wind turbines, we wouldn't even be sitting here today having this conversation at all. So yes, it is the reactors. And it's no good sort of saying, well, you know, we can't have nuclear power plants in a war zone, because it's pretty difficult to predict, you know, where a war might break out next. Even in the United States, the words civil war have come up quite a bit in the last few years, and especially now as we see the rise of the far right and militias. And just a week or so ago, we saw an attack on the grid in North Carolina. And this, you know, really brought home a message about how much we should be worrying not only about Zaporizhzhia and the Ukraine nuclear power plants, but all nuclear power plants, including the ones here, because it's the loss of off-site power. You know, reactors rely on the grid to bring in the electricity they need to run. It's the loss of off-site power followed by the potential loss of on-site power that's also a severe risk, especially for the reactors in Ukraine bombarded in a war zone, but anywhere at any time. And when and if something were to happen, especially the worst, I mean, obviously, if there was a bombardment of Zaporizhzhia or any of the other reactors in Ukraine, or the fuel pools caught fire, or the casks were breached, we're talking about a major disaster, which Alec just described. You know, the duration of the radioactivity, the widespread nature of it, down generations would be tragic. But imagine it even on a local level. Right now, you have people in Ukraine who are cold, they have no power, they have no electricity, they have no running water, they're short of food. You add a radiological disaster to that environment, you ramp up the level of suffering and misery by orders of magnitude, and you also create a situation where rescue becomes really problematic. We saw this actually in 2011 at the Fukushima nuclear disaster, because that was precipitated, of course, by a major earthquake and the tsunami, and people who needed to be rescued from those so-called natural disasters, some of them were inaccessible to first responders because they were also in areas of high radiation. And lastly, of course, reactors in a situation where there is an extreme weather event or a war have to, from a precautionary point of view, power or shut down completely, which means they're then not available to provide the very necessary electricity that people already suffering from those other events need. So there are a liability at every single phase. And then we've talked a little bit about a dirty bomb. You know, what does that mean? And I think Alec touched on that as well. You know, it isn't about people running into the power plant and stealing some of the radioactive material and fashioning it into a crude device with a traditional explosive. This is about the reactor itself, or the fuel pool, and especially the casks, serving as dirty bombs themselves. The casks sit outside the protected containment area, so they don't have that extra layer of robustness and could be breached, and again, would release a massive amount of radiation into the environment. We have to remember, you know, that people live in Hiroshima today. You know, this is not in any way to diminish or downplay the horrors of what transpired there, but people do live in Hiroshima today. No one is going to live in that 1,000 square mile Chernobyl exclusion zone for the foreseeable future. So the scale of the tragedy and the amount of people that we could be seeing inflicted with harm is enormous. And of course, we're not just looking at the harm, we shouldn't just look at the harm of nuclear power plants in a war zone. Nuclear power has harmed millions of people every day because of the entire uranium fuel chain process that's needed to make a nuclear reactor run at all. And that is especially true at the very beginning with uranium mining, and also at the end with the largely mismanaged issue of what to do with the nuclear waste, some of which has been dumped into poor, unwilling communities. In the uranium mining end of things, you know, you're talking about a huge amount of radioactive detritus left behind in the environment perpetually, and often amongst communities which are deprived, indigenous communities or communities of color. So when you really look at the scale of who nuclear power has harmed, not just in the instance of a major disaster that could occur like Chernobyl or Fukushima, or possibly now in Ukraine, but always and forever from the beginning of the uranium mining through the whole chain, we're talking about an enormous amount of people. So when we look at Zaporizhzhia, what do we do? This is the conundrum. The IAEA has talked about, we must have a sort of no fire zone. You cannot have fighting around the plant, but it hasn't been implemented yet. And yet out of the other side of their mouths at the COP27 climate summit, you had the head of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, there actually promoting the continued use of nuclear power. So that level of hypocrisy, I feel, makes the IAEA a somewhat inadequate body to really clamp down and find a solution to protecting these plants. There have been some efforts, one particular by World Beyond War. You can see more about this at worldbeyondwar.org, and one of its board members, John Ruhr, who I believe is on this webinar today, who they're beginning to set up an unarmed civilian protection unit, which will be people who will actually go there. And I'm not going to get into detail about this because I don't know yet a lot about it and how people would be able to stay safe and how this would work. But what it does is exemplifies what we really need, which is regular citizens communicating the message of peace and the necessity for us to stop the madness. And clearly, there are only two solutions to the nuclear dangers in Ukraine. One is we must have a ceasefire, and the other is that we must take this as the ultimate lesson and not continue to use nuclear power as a form of electricity there or anywhere else. And finally, most importantly, I think, is that nuclear power must not be welcomed into the nuclear disarmament fold as a consolation prize for disavowing nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, that is a clause that is in both the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And what that does is it leaves the drawbridge down, as you would, from nuclear power to nuclear weapons perpetually for countries to use that so-called inalienable right, which is in those two identical clauses, to develop nuclear energy, which inevitably leads to the possibility of the continued use of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. The other thing is that the types of reactors that are being pushed today, small modular reactors, are ostensibly fast reactors, and these are very proliferation friendly. So by leaving that drawbridge open for the inalienable right, that means that you are probably making the chances of nuclear weapons being developed by non-nuclear weapons nations more likely. And so I'm asking you today, or inviting you as members of Peace Action, to cross that bridge with me and draw it up behind us and forever oppose both nuclear power and nuclear weapons in the same breath and with the same level of vehemence, because that's, as movements, that's what we really need to do to unite, to end the use of this dangerous technology. Thank you.
Linda, thank you. That was very comprehensive, very, very helpful. I'm reminded of it's a long time that people in the peace movement have been, and in the nuclear power abolition movement, have been pointing to the reality that the two are linked, and you can't have really one without the other. Before we move to the Q&A session with participants, we wanted to give Linda and Oleg an opportunity, if they wish, to ask one another a question or two, and to have time to respond. So Oleg or Linda, if you have questions for one another, the floor is yours.
Well, Oleg, I know that you have worked most particularly in the Baltic area, trying to stop some of the Russian reactors in Finland, especially. And I just wondered where things, whether the war situation has changed the possibility of those reactors happening for better or for worse. Has it made it easier to try to stop them or harder because of what's going on in Ukraine?
Good question, Linda. First of all, I'd like to say Russia started to construct Hanhikivi nuclear power plant in Finland, but after the occupation of Ukraine, Finnish government stopped this project And now it is not any more activities in this area. It is in the Botnik Bay in the Baltic Sea. In the same time, in Russia, we have more and more organization, more active organization who received the status foreign agent. It is now much more difficult to act in Russia because immediately, if we will criticize any Russian Russian plan about the nuclear power construction in Russia, we have very strong reaction, not only from the government, but from the special security service in Russia, and it is more and more dangerous. And from the 1st of December, we have a new law about foreign agent, adaptation of the law, and it's possible to get 7 years of the prison if we will act against the Russian policy. And I think we have some ideas how to continue to act. And one of the ideas is to cooperate with the regional deputies and municipal deputies, which is very depend from the who live close to the nuclear objects, and they more sensitive. And our strategy to motivate, to give some analysis of the information and to cooperate with new stakeholders. This is our strategy now, and it's started to function. Thank you.
Other questions between the two of you? I'm looking now through the Q&A questions we've got here, and people will be a little bit patient with me. There's a question from John Ruwer. Can Oleg expand on the relative radionuclide load at Chernobyl, which was a single reactor meltdown in a fairly new plant? If you could compare that with the nuclear waste pools and casks at Zaporizhzhia. So asking for comparisons between the two plants.
Between Zaporizhzhia and Chernobyl, yes?
Yes.
I think they have very different risks. For example, Chernobyl nuclear power plant have moderator, carbon like moderator of the thermoneutrons. And there are more than 5,000 tons of the carbon inside of the Chernobyl type reactors. If will be fire on these reactors after the maybe military attack, will be fire, and this carbon, it is not stable carbon, but carbon 14, and this carbon have half lifetime 5,700 years. So if this carbon with in the form of dioxide of carbon will come to the nature, it will be very serious consequences, much more serious than radiative contamination, because this carbon will be captured by the plant. I mean, some plant in the nature, some plankton, and it will be part of the. It will include to the. Sorry, my English will be part of the ecosystem, and it is a risk if this carbon will be part of the genetical molecules. And I think it is very high risk, and we provide analysis of this problem, and I can give you a link about these risks. But if we will compare with the pressurized water reactor, like in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, there are risks of the explosion if the reactor will be attacked and destroyed, and the spent fuel rods will be destroyed too, and the plutonium and other radionuclides will come to the nature, and it will be domination of the radioactive contamination of the nature, and it is high risk too. But from my point of view, the accident on Chernobyl nuclear power plant with the destroying of the spent fuel rods and carbon moderator will be more serious and more dramatical consequences for the nature. And this is my answer.
Thank you, Oleg. Number of questions coming in here. I'm going to give pride of place here to my colleague Rosalie Anders, who is asking a question that many people are asking. Some prominent, this I guess for Linda, some prominent climate activists are embracing the possibility of small nuclear power plants with a different technology that won't emit greenhouse gases. What do you think of this?
Well, nothing doesn't, there's no energy technology that emits no greenhouse gases. I mean, this whole zero carbon, is a myth, even for renewable energy. I mean, all of these technologies require some. So we're talking about the scale, and it's the difficulty with the small modular reactors is primarily the economy of scale. I mean, you would have to have so many of them in order to achieve an economy of scale. And that requires upfront investment in a factory. I mean, this is a whole nother, it's not really relevant to Zaporizhzhia so much, but it's a whole nother conversation. But there's a snapshot of it is really that if we're talking about addressing climate, or we should say the climate crisis, if we're talking about addressing the climate crisis in time, which we're clearly already not doing, the last thing we need to do is waste time and money trying to develop another kind of nuclear reactor that has already been proven on paper not to work so well, has lots of safety risks, is going to cost a fortune and take forever. We need to do all the things that we have available to us now that would reduce more carbon faster for the same investment of money. And that is renewable energy, energy efficiency especially, and conservation. So the only reason that small modular reactors are even being mentioned at all is, in my view, the connection to the nuclear weapons sector, because the know-how of that particular technology is essential to the continued development and maintenance of the nuclear weapons arsenal. And that is in black and white. Actually, I've written about that, a couple of times already on Beyond Nuclear International. It's in the documentation as being the essential lifeline, the civil nuclear sector to the military nuclear sector. If you cut that off because you're closing your nuclear power plants down and don't replace it with small modular reactors, they're in big trouble. And I think that's why it continues.
So follow-up questions, if you may, here in the Q&A session. One from Peter Burgell. Again to Linda, what do you think is the best way to stop federal investment into small modular reactors here in the US? And I guess a related question, which you've just in part answered from an anonymous attendee. I've heard a lot of science articles and mainstream media sites that the use of nuclear thorium reactors would be safer and produce less waste. It seems unlikely, but is there any truth to this?
It is unlikely. And actually, we have a fact sheet on our old website, which I just pulled up on thorium, because thorium, I mean, there's no thorium reactor. This is a thorium fueled reactor, which will still use uranium, also probably plutonium, would require the restart of reprocessing in this country, which is a hugely proliferation risky enterprise. It's very susceptible then to production of weapons grade material. It wouldn't eliminate the waste problem. So attempts to develop the thorium reactors have failed over the years. This is just another sort of diversion. It's another attempt by the nuclear industry to stay in there somewhere with something that has already been proven a failure. But as you'll have to remind me, I'm sorry, what the first part of that question is, because I answered the second part first.
The
stopping the federal spending on small.
Yes, how to stop it.
That's a huge, that's the billion-dollar question, I guess, because obviously there is literally billions of dollars in the federal budgets that we're seeing now, the various, Inflation Reduction Act and other, to not only keep new old reactors running, but also to invest in various machinations, and there are lots of different designs of these small modular reactors. And I think it has to come from people power. That's why groups like Peace Action exist, on the ground. It has to come from the electorate, because the elected officials represent us. They work for us. They have to do our bidding. If our bidding is that we don't want these, then they won't do them. So it just requires all of us to continue to let our elected officials know that that is not the route to solving climate change. That is a route to making proliferation greater and to waste time and money that we have precious little of either right now in addressing climate change in the way that we could, which would be deploying the resources we have towards using it for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and conservation.
I'm going to take a question that's here in the chat. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the Al Barvely is challenging that low enriched nuclear fuel in many of the nuclear power plants is not an easy backdoor to developing nuclear weapons. And I wonder if each of you would like to respond to that. Maybe Oleg, you want to go first?
Yes, I can. I'd like to inform that Chernobyl type reactor RBMK-1000, it is double technology. It is possible to produce weapon grade plutonium on this type of reactors. So it was constructed like development of the military reactor for the weapon grade plutonium production. Now it is absolutely, it is very close technology, and it is possible to use this so-called civil nuclear reactors for the production of the plutonium. So it is, and this type of reactors we have only in Russia, but in Russia, and Ukraine, and Lithuania. But now 9 reactors RBMK continue to operate in Russia. So Russia have possibilities to produce plutonium on this type of reactor.
So Linda, let me ask you to respond as well, but if you could also put it in the context of power plants that are proliferating in the global south, as well as among the the more industrialized nations.
Yeah, I think, without getting into the technical issues about, the fuel, I think the more important thing is, and I didn't say that, we're going to use current nuclear power plants to make nuclear weapons. I was talking about the small modular reactors, which in many ways are fast, reactors. So they are much more proliferation dangerous. But let's have a look at, for example, Iran. I mean, here's an example of a country that is enriching uranium, and it's saying that it's enriching uranium. Well, it was before the uranium was broken by the Trump administration. It was saying that it was enriching uranium in order to use in civilian nuclear power programs, and it's allowed to do this. This is precisely the utilization of Article 4 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran has signed, which is its right to use safe, so-called safe nuclear power. But there's a blurry line. I mean, the reason that everybody is so alarmed about Iran is they know full well that they could continue to enrich that uranium to higher grades and therefore transition to a nuclear weapons program. If that weren't the case, then no one would be worried about Iran, because they'd be doing exactly what they say they are under the terms of the NPT, which, unlike the United States, which is not disarming its nuclear weapons, Iran has so far abided by the terms of the NPT. So that's why it's such a blurry line. We just don't know what they're doing, and it's possible to do it. And the small modular reactors, most of those designs require a high assay, low enriched uranium fuel known as HALEU, which at the moment is only made in Russia, ironically, and has to be enriched up to close to 20% U-235, which makes that material, at the very least, weapons usable, not weapons grade. And so in order to launch a proper small modular reactor program in the US, there's now talk from people like Joe Manchin of setting up uranium enrichment facilities in the US to develop this higher enriched uranium fuel. So this is all going down the wrong path, in the wrong direction, closer to the tie with nuclear weapons, instead of in the peaceful direction, which would be abolishing nuclear power.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive answer. Only to add that in conversations that I've been hearing, there's a fear that Iran is going to follow the Israeli model in terms of developing a nuclear weapon, but not announcing it, which in turn will generate proliferation among the Arab states, again, using their nuclear power plants as a foundation.
And Joe, that's exactly why, you see countries like United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, all very interested in developing nuclear power programs. And you have to ask yourself, why would a country like Saudi Arabia, if they need electricity, to replace oil, because they don't want to use so much of their oil, they want to export more of it, obviously, to make more money. Why would they choose nuclear power as the form of electricity? Why wouldn't they choose solar or wind in a place like Saudi Arabia? Obviously, much more logical. The only reason they're choosing nuclear power is because of that potential to transition to nuclear weapons.
Yes, unfortunately. There's basically an announcement here rather than a question in Q&A, but I'm going to read it anyway, from Diane Darigo. Nuclear Information and Resource Service, Beyond Nuclear, and Union of Concerned Scientists are preparing a letter and alert to oppose it. Need all U.S. citizens to ask their senators and representatives to oppose Bill Senate 4064, which proliferates nuclear. So I just would ask that perhaps the link to that might be sent to Cole Harrison at Mass Peace Action, and we can include reference to that when we send out a thank you on the other side. Here's from Linda Walker. Does Linda think that the UK government is serious about going ahead with further nuclear power plants after Hinkley? The funding just doesn't seem to be available for this now that the Chinese participation has been rejected. Perhaps you could give a little bit of background on that for most people who on the call who may not be familiar with the background to both the Chinese early participation and now the Chinese being pushed out.
Well, Linda actually knows probably more about this than I do. She's actually there tracking this, but fundamentally, the next in line after Hinkley. So Hinkley at the moment has 2 reactors being built. They're French reactors. There are EPRs, which is one of the bigger fiascos in terms of reactor design ever. They negotiated what's called a strike price with the UK government, which means they can charge consumers about triple what they currently pay in their electricity rates in order to pay upfront for the costs of this plant. These 2 reactors still not built. The next 2 in line are at Sizewell in Suffolk, incredibly pretty much on the beach. I mean, these reactors would be underwater under the climate crisis. Also French reactors with Chinese investment. The UK government, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is, they're very nervous about Chinese involvement in nuclear technology, rightly so. But as I understand it, Lynn, they've just recently announced a massive subsidy for a government subsidy for Sizewell, which will be charged to the ratepayers of the UK. They've also got a similar law in place, regulated asset base, which is a bit like construction work in progress here in the US, which means you pay in your rates while the reactor is under construction for this end product, which may never happen. This is what we saw in South Carolina, where people paid for 2 reactors that were never completed and were subsequently abandoned. But as for what the UK government will do, I mean, Linda knows as well as I do that the UK government we have right now is going to go, gung-ho for nuclear, regardless of the evidence of the lack of affordability of it and the better alternatives available.
We have a question from Paula Gutlove asking, what do you think would be the best way to provide psychosocial support to the people most at risk from Zaporizhzhia? So the question is how to support people, I think, emotionally from the dangers that are inherent in both the power plant to begin with, but then with the being caught in the middle of battle here. What, if anything, I guess maybe the question would be anything can be done to address their understandable fears.
I no idea. Sorry, and it is very difficult to support the people. And I know that there are military administration in Energodar, Russian military administration, and they have strategy to um, to uh, to invite the personnel from the nuclear power plant to be Russian citizens and to work to get Russian to Russian passports and to act. And I think reasonable to inform that not recommend to do it. I think these people, it's not so easy, I think, for the Ukrainian people, because they are really people who was a part of the Soviet nuclear industry, and they speak in Russian, and at the same time now they became enemies. And I think only one way to be strong, and I wish this Ukrainian specialist to be healthy and to be strong, not only not anymore recommendations.
So we're approaching the end of the hour, and before giving her the floor to close us out, there's a question from Susan Mirsky. Given the increased danger of nuclear power plants, is there anything that the international community can do, including and aside from the IAEA? What can the international community do? I would say here, both in response to Zaporizhzhia, but also with the growing danger of nuclear power plants as they continue to be built and to threaten our survival. Whoever would like to go first.
Well, I just want to add on to that last question first. It's not a psychological answer, but it is a medical answer, which is that one of the fundamental things that should happen in Ukraine has already happened, I believe, in Poland and possibly in Ukraine, is the distribution of potassium iodide, which is a prophylactic protection against the iodine 131 gas, which would be released first in the instance of a major nuclear disaster and attacks the thyroid. It doesn't protect you from anything else, but it does protect you from thyroid cancer while you have a chance to evacuate. Now, obviously, that chance to evacuate is probably the least practical option in Ukraine, but it's a project that we've launched even in the US, that everybody living within at least 10 miles, if not realistically 50 or further, of a nuclear power plant should have free access to potassium iodide as a prophylactic protection for at least their thyroid, because that's the first thing that'll arrive in the event of a major disaster. As far as how you resolve this whole issue, it's just, it's so complex. I think it's so difficult to, I mean, I lie awake at night wondering why, in the context of a climate crisis, which involves all of us on this planet, in which we should all be giving our undevoted attention to solving, we are fighting over pieces of land. I mean, why is that even relevant at this point? Nobody's going to have any pieces of land if we don't deal with climate crisis. So to be fighting over, this is my territory, this is your territory, is primitive behavior at a time when we as a human species should be at our most sophisticated and at our most united. And so I think as peace movements and disarmament movements, that's a message, is to integrate all these issues together. They're not separate. It isn't just about maybe Putin will use a tactical nuclear weapon, horrible though that would be. It isn't just about what might happen to nuclear power plants or just about climate crisis and oil and coal and fossil fuels. They're all connected. And it's an idealistic pipe dream, obviously, that we would all suddenly wake up and get together and say, right, we're all on this planet together. We're going to do everything now to save it and stop this needless fighting, which is going on, obviously, in other places. We don't talk about Congo, where there's 5-6 million people dead fighting mostly over mineral rights. That's another Holocaust. We don't talk about it. So those are the things, the grand plans. But on a day-to-day level, each of us just have to do whatever is in our power to do, I think.
Thank you, Linda. That's absolutely spot on. And Oleg, the last word is yours in terms of what people can do.
I like idea which is recommended International Peace Bureau to stop any military activities from the 25th of December. It is Catholic Christmas and Russian Orthodox Church Christmas 7th of December. To stop during 2 weeks, I think it will be a good chance to continue this process. I mean, to stop military activities, because Russian soldiers' mother, it is maybe most active group in Russia now who want to protect his sons and fathers in Ukraine. And I think it is only one group who really want to do and who really do something in Russia now. And so only this way to stop during 2 weeks any military activities.
Oleg, thank you. And I think I speak for all of us here in wishing you safety and for all of us and to the war. Just to reiterate that you're here as a friend, not as a foreign agent, and we just really appreciate what it is that you do. Susan, the floor is yours.
Okay, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today, and this is obviously a part of an ongoing discussion and an effort to see what we can do, whether here in Massachusetts, in the United States, as part of a larger international community, what we can do to make the world a safer place, which means recognizing those dangers of nuclear plants, both in war and in peace. We are parents, we are grandparents, we are young people wanting to see the future. So for our future's sake, we need to do something. Thank you all. And again, a reminder about the program on December 14th, the webinar, Russia and Europe, the Ukraine War and Possibilities for Euro-Atlantic Peace. And then also, please sign on to the Christmas truce. Thank you.
Colleagues, somebody asked to send, to get my presentation. I can send Joseph, and you can get it from Joseph. So thank you for your support and for this discussion. I think it is extremely important for the Russian peace activists, because we feel, myself, me and my colleagues feel we need some moral support from the Western countries, because we are part of the common peace activities, and unfortunately we have no to discuss face to face now, and it is some limitation of our activities. And thank you for the chance to do it today, and I hope we will win. Thank you.
Be well, be safe.
Peace.
Bye.